Ready? Hello, everyone. Well, I represent government, so here comes bureaucracy. So I hope that it'll still be interesting. It's been a great 2 days for me to listen in on what you're all working on and what drives your research in this field. And I'm with the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. And it's a relatively new concept in the world. We're an agency that we're kind of alone. There is no government agency like ours in the world, really, although there's plenty of capacity, and we see more and more in identifying and analyzing and countering foreign malign information influence. And so on my desk as well, I focus on analysis when it comes to social media, AI, gaming platforms, so the digital platform space, that's with me. And then I also have colleagues that look at a variety of areas, so I will get into that a bit more to describe how we work, and then I'll come to a few cases so that you'll understand also how we've had to deal with actual disinformation attacks targeting our country. And so I'll just show you our mission here. This is sort of like basically just our basic message here. So we safeguard our open and democratic society and the free formation of opinion by identifying, analyzing, and countering foreign malign information influence, disinformation, and other misleading information directed at Sweden or Swedish interests. And I want you to note the free formation of opinion, basically the freedom of speech part, because I'll get to that over and over again throughout my talk, and it's usually sort of pitched against the internal space that one would be dealing with and the threat, the foreign space, targeting our country. And we work according to sort of two pillars. We have a long-term strategy. We build a strong psychological defense, is what we usually say, by raising awareness and improving the ability to handle disinformation, propaganda, and manipulation from foreign actors. And this is achieved through education, research, cooperation with societal stakeholders. And research, we're very proud of. 10% of our budget goes towards research, and we also fund a research institute for psychological defense at Lund University. So I think it can be good for you guys to know this, and that we do have, we're very interested in research that would be pertinent for psychological defense. We also have an operational strategy. That's where we identify, analyze, and support the response to malign information influence aimed at Sweden. And this includes disinformation intended to weaken our nation's resilience and the public's will to defend or influence people's perceptions, behavior, and decision-making. And the agency works both preventatively and operationally, as I mentioned. So this is designed to function in peacetime, but also during wartime. And we aim to contribute to a robust Swedish defense that prevents conflicts and maintains peace. So we're a civil defense capacity. And this means that I have to sort of reinforce this, but we only look at the foreign threats. And when it comes to our internal space, that's the other side of the coin. That's where we monitor vulnerabilities. So that's our democratic space, and we look at like what can be attacked. And that includes a strength. Doesn't necessarily have to be something that you'd be like, oh, this is a vulnerability. But that's how we look at it. So that's how we separate the foreign versus the internal. And our approach involves mapping and closely monitoring how foreign actors operate and how do their infrastructure look like. So we focus less on disinformation, misinformation, content from that perspective, but we look at their infrastructure, how they attack, and what channels and methods are used, what narratives are they pushing, what accounts, platforms, and individuals are they employing or using. By doing this, we can receive early warnings of threats directed towards Sweden, and we can act if necessary. So in our response ladder, and I'll get to that later, there's obviously like like a range of responses and we have different toolboxes, including the one for the internal space and the one for the threat actor space. And it's important to emphasize, yet again, that it's the foreign parts that I'm going to be talking about more. Now, I just also have to describe a bit more here what is actually psychological defense. We were talking about it here earlier. So the ultimate goal of psychological defense is to protect the open democratic society that we all live in, and the free formation of opinion and Sweden's freedom and independence. It also strengthens the public's ability to detect and resist influence campaigns and disinformation. That's on our table, to also reinforce that knowledge and the awareness in our country. And in doing so, psychological defense fosters resilience and a collective will to defend the nation among citizens and within our society. So a strong psychological defense, it's not solely the responsibility of our agency. It's the Swedish population. It's actually all of you. You're part of a psychological defense concept. So this is something that we carry with us in our work all the time. So we build this together with authorities and municipalities and organizations, and importantly, individual citizens. So I have colleagues that work towards religious groups, civil society and youth, colleagues that specifically are like fantastic teachers that develop curricula for our educational programs. We do train the trainer programs, and that is sort of disseminated throughout our society. And I also just want to emphasize, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this, but this is something that we do have to talk about quite extensively, because somehow it needs to sort of land in the right realm when I get to the different cases also that I will talk about. So, because our mandate focuses on identifying and countering activities from foreign powers, as I mentioned, and they need to be deceptive. And so we do need to see a certain coordination. The deceptiveness needs to be there, and we see that based on the tools that we ourselves develop in order to monitor and map. And we also need to see the intention to harm, so individuals, organizations, or Sweden as a country, and the potentially serious consequences that comes out of that for Swedish society and decision-making processes. And this type of influence usually occurs in the open arena, through the intent, source, and methods, then must often, they have to be concealed. And so it's important to note that this type of influence is not often illegal. We all know this. However, since it can have serious consequences, we must act. So the consequences may impact society's functionality, public health, and more, and that's what we're also set to protect. So there is a clear boundary. If the actions are criminal, it becomes a matter for our law enforcement. That's the internal space, with close cooperation with law enforcement, or with our intelligence community. So, for example, if it relates to terrorism and terror threats. So we're not law enforcement, and we're not intelligence. So we have our particular mandate. But that close cooperation, because we also work with content that is classified, we can have fruitful exchanges. So the ultimate goal of influencing a country, the way we see it, is to affect its politics and decision makers. So since it's difficult to target politicians directly in a democracy, media and social media are often used to influence the population. So this is not new for us here in this space, but it can in turn affect independent decision making. So this gives media and social media platforms significant responsibility in managing such influence. And this is where we also have a mandate to support media, independent media. We usually say that the cornerstones of a strong psychological defense is independent media, an informed population, and also trust between individuals and institutions. So those are strong cornerstones that we have to maintain that type of the strength that we have the luxury in Sweden still, that we have high trust in government, for example, and institutions, so we can use that in the way we work. We do support media quite extensively, and we have seen that media is also learning more and more about this, and that they are themselves incorporating something that they call forensic journalism. So it started a few years ago with BBC Verify, and now Swedish television is using, it's on that level, this type of forensic journalism where they also, they basically go at a deeper level to look at what's AI produced, for example, and how and where things come from. So this is new in our media space, and we have had extensive dialogue with media in order to sort of learn from each other in this. So why does information influence sometimes work? Well, it's when there is a lack of awareness of a threat and its nature, and insights into an organization also, the risks and vulnerabilities regarding information influence, where there's a lack of that. When tools and knowledge to understand, identify, and handle that type of information influence, when that's non-existent. When coordination between relevant actors, both in daily operations and during special events, is just not there. And the ability to implement countermeasures when incidents occur. So the fundamentals, as I mentioned, we have media, we have a well-informed public, we have trust between citizen institutions and authorities, and then we have sort of like, our psychological defense agency, we're trying to fill these spaces of vulnerability, and then we reach out to these important target groups in our society in a variety of ways. And this is how we work. Now, this is a setup that we sort of, this is our structure, and when it comes to, for example, the EU elections, now I'll draw parallels. So because we do work with identifying threats, we do have a way of working systematically of increasing awareness about a threat, for example, or about information influence in general. We do work with, we have on our desk, we're responsible for strengthening coordination in Sweden, and we do have a system to support and respond. So if you take these elements, and now if we talk about just the EU elections, for example. So we were given the assignment to protect Sweden when it comes to the EU elections. And so to begin with, we monitored, analyzed, and continuously assessed threats and vulnerabilities from a Swedish perspective, however. And we were learning from other elections around the globe, and we still are. I mean, this is a super election year, in fact. So, and we also, in the coordination aspect of things, we worked to strengthen coordination in various ways. And a very important forum is the National Election Network, and which is led by the Swedish Electoral Authority. So, and several security agencies they participate in this network. So we have the intelligence community, law enforcement, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, which is like an all-hazard agency, basically, the head of office of the county administration, so all municipalities in all of Sweden, and their head office is a member of this network, and the National Cybersecurity Center, and us, MPF. And so we conduct joint exercises regularly. We share situational pictures like pulse reports with each other, and synchronized our preparations in case anything would happen. So there is a close dialogue, and if something would sort of happen, then we already have those connection points to each other. And an important difference between national elections and elections to the European Parliament, well, that means the increased need for international cooperation in general and cooperation with the EU in particular. So the elections that we have in Sweden, well, they're national, but in this case, you'd say it's a composition of like a transnational phenomenon for us to take into account. So this can give rise to new vulnerabilities that we were looking at, like antagonist actor from a third country, for example, that can target weaknesses in the entire EU system and specific countries with consequences for all member states. And for that reason, we cooperate also closely with the EU in what is called the Rapid Alert System, for example, where our sister organizations around the EU's member states and EU bodies share incident reports and tune in on an ongoing basis. And a part of the awareness raising, well, we train central actors and civil society organizations, and we do this continuously, but when it comes to the EU elections, we sort of intensify our efforts. We have a structural dialogue with major social media platforms and tech companies, and we gather the Swedish media houses for a continuous dialogue. So then we, like I mentioned, we sort of intensify this when something is happening. And we also relaunched our national communication campaign that we call Don't Be Fooled. We launched it 2 years ago when it came to our own elections and because of the war in Ukraine. And basically it's about a general public in Sweden to understand the risks with disinformation, but less about the disinformation aspect, again, not to cause worry, but more about like learning the tips and the tricks of the trade, of understanding, so the awareness aspect of it. And this information campaign is seen on billboards, social media. We were all over TV, like everywhere, so ads everywhere. So we really made it visible, and we studied the effects of the receptiveness of this campaign as well, of course. Support and respond. Well, we do have sort of pre-prepared actions in when it comes to the elections in this case, subjected to, if it would be subjected to a malign information influence campaign. And as part of our national election network, that's where we would sort of ignite like whatever is going on, and we would bring in our knowledge. I'm going to speed up a bit, I think, but I'm going to get to Russia, which is of great importance to Sweden to monitor. But I want to just show you here, 2022, this is when we opened our doors, actually. We do have a long history of psychological defense since the 50s, sort of dissipated a bit, and then in 2018, our prime minister said, well, we're going to need an agency in this arena. So, and then we opened our doors January 1st, 2022. And we basically hit the ground running. We looked at our accession process to NATO, which was of great interest to foreign antagonist actors. We had a disinformation campaign targeting Sweden right at that time. We also had our own national elections in 2022. The war in Ukraine started in February 2022, and then followed by the war in Gaza, which is something that we monitor closely as well because of the actors themselves in the information space. And we also had the EU elections. So it's been like full on, I have to say. We have so much work that it's not even funny. And this is, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the disinformation campaign targeting Sweden, which is something that we talk a little bit less about in media, but I think it's relevant in this room because it's a concrete example. And the reason why we talk less about it now is because the actors that attacked Sweden, and they're still interested in us, they have refocused a bit, and now they're looking more towards the war in Gaza. But there is always sort of it can loop back pretty quickly. But what happened here was that non-state actors, ideologically motivated actors, they basically used a true falsehood, like a lie. Here we actually could determine that it was a concrete lie, although that often doesn't matter, right? But they started to spread information about Swedish social services kidnapping children, Muslim children, and placing them in Swedish foster homes and forcing them to be secularized. So they had this perfect sort of, I would say, like pieces of information that could be used against vulnerable target groups in Sweden and the Muslims outside, basically, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Africa, that would react to this very strongly. And we also know that ideological environments are quite complex, so we have deep knowledge of these environments, and this is what some of my colleagues are working on. Really? Oh dear. Okay, so, but what I can, what's that? Okay, but I'm going to just basically then head to Russia. But I just wanted to mention, with regards to this, basically it spread like wildfire. It started on YouTube, and it reached media in the Middle East, and it became huge very quickly. And so we understood that it was coordinated and that we needed to respond to this. And I'll get to the response. Oh my God, I have that left too. And then I just wanted to say also here, Russian disinformation targeting Sweden. We do know at this point, Sweden has often been quite resistant to Russian influence, but we are keeping a close eye on that can shift very quickly. And we have identified Russia as a significant threat to Sweden and to Europe. And I would say that Sweden is continuously subjected to Russian disinformation. And what they particularly are looking for is to polarize society and erode trust in key institutions. And I just also want to mention, I'll just swirl through this real fast, but what's interesting is that they use the key narratives. I want you to particularly focus on that. They depict Sweden as weak and dependent on foreign powers, especially the US, and they promote the idea of Sweden's impending societal collapse to erode trust, and they undermine liberal democracy in Sweden as part of a broader anti-Western agenda. And this is the same as with the disinformation attack from the ideologically motivated actors, the Islamist actors. They use Sweden as a pawn in the game of sort of Islamophobia, and that Sweden is part of the West that is Islamophobic. Sweden was heavily targeted by the Islamist actors, and our threat level that the intelligence community said went up. And we also saw some serious threats towards the Swedish social services, civil servants, and so on. So it became serious very quick. And then I'm going to skip this because I did mention the EU elections a little bit. But what's important here to know is that this network, the Doppelganger Network, has also started in Germany in 2022. It's reached the US. And what we see is a shift from using social media platforms quite extensively to developing websites instead that look like traditional media websites. So The Guardian, so you can see here so there is a way of trying to remove themselves from areas that they can be easily identified or more easily identified. And I'm going to finish up. This is my, on the right, is that right? Yeah, that's my head of, or chief of staff of the agency together with our prime minister. This is the outmost on the response ladder. We go in a press conference and then we hit media really hard to deplatform if we can attribute. There's a few other things that we do in our preparedness phase that sort of we build into that long-term strategy that I mentioned and the operational strategy that I mentioned. So it all sort of goes hand in hand. And this is my last message to you all. Thank you. I think we have a question there.
So question, in some cases it's straightforward if the external threat is outside. Russia is outside the organization or the country. What do you do if the malign threat is internal? In the United States, for example, we have one group trying to assassinate the character of another. They have their own free speech rights. How do you deal with it when the malign influence is internal and perhaps the external agency seems to amplify only to create dissensus?
Yeah.
What do you do when it's inside?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is, depending on what for example, what you just mentioned, then it goes to law enforcement and the intelligence community. So we have to have that particular, it's like a line that we don't cross. Of course, in our mapping, when we see at a certain point, we can see that there are actors that are, if we go into the Swedish space, we can see that we can identify that it is in our Swedish space, not just the external space, the foreign space. So, but then we actually stop, and then we have to hand it over to our intelligence community. So we have to keep it extremely strict. Yeah, it sounds like it would be very difficult to navigate, and it is.
Super interesting. Thank you, Andrea. How do you guys think about the indicators or actual measurements for when a vulnerability is actually closed or a threat is eliminated?
Yeah, that's also a good question. And we do have, I would say, certain toolboxes. I can't really talk about them openly, but we do have indicators that show when it's intensifying to a point where then we have to decide of how we use our responses. So, but like I mentioned earlier, and it would be the way that I can talk about it is that we need to see certain indicators. And so that's how but because we monitor the space as much as we do, and we have really, really good knowledge of the antagonist actors for a few years now, we can pretty much determine, it's of course not with 100% certainty, but we can determine when we can see the intensification coming, although for a normal, viewer, they wouldn't know that would be coming. So we do have these early warning methods that we apply in our work.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Nate Lubin, for those I don't know. I feel like an interloper here, hearing all these talks. I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. I got my background in campaigns and government. I worked for Barack Obama for a bunch of years. I now spend my time running a data collection company, a software company, and a nonprofit, and hang out with the Berkman Klein Center on some policy and regulatory questions. So today you're going to not get any data from me, so it'll be a bit different than the rest of these talks, even though most of my life is spent in data. I'm going to talk about a paper with some colleagues at Berkman, so just acknowledge Kaylee, Dylan, Manon, Luke, and Andrew, some of whom have come up in prior presentations. But we were asked to think about the social media problems specifically, which we've worked in before, and there are a lot of potential interventions that have been proposed in policy. Is there feedback? We can stand back further.
Maybe try closer to the mic?
Closer?
Maybe? I don't know. That might work.
Let me see if that's better. Okay. So the idea here was we were asked to think about what are potential interventions and ways that we could think about to improve the kind of various problems that are happening online. Obviously, there are a lot of laws that have been proposed. I'm sure you all have seen many, many versions of this. Through lines, a lot of this has been obviously on the speech side of constraints and thinking about ways to do moderation better. Thanks to work of many in this room, that has obviously been shifting a bit more in recent years. But the idea here was to try to do a bit of a review of what has been proposed and what has actually been passed in the last number of years. So this is a lot of that. Whether you believe the rest of what I say here, this was the work of one of our team members, sort of cataloging the various laws that have been both passed and proposed in the last 5 or 6 years. And so this is in the appendix of this paper, which I'll link afterward, but it could be useful for whatever your purposes are. The key thing to take away from this, though, is that there's a lot, and a lot more that doesn't get attention than what we normally consider as the core of the kind of main interventions. And so we can ask this question of how do these proposed laws or actually passed laws relate to each other, and what are some opportunities that might be available to us to kind of take the various data and interventions that are coming out of research to push on different directions. And so the reason for this is to try to compare the jurisdictions a bit more directly. Obviously, the US doesn't pass very many laws at the national level these days, despite a lot of proposals. We can kind of think about some of the trade-offs that are coming from those various interventions, and in particular, think about what are the things that are potentially impactful that really haven't gotten a lot of attention, and that last point is the real goal of this. This purpose of this paper was less for the folks in this room and more for regulators, and our sense is that very often folks are coming to these problems with a solution and looking for a way to implement it, rather than coming to this with a problem and trying to find the right opportunity to actually respond to that problem. And so in service of that, we were trying to map the products themselves as the primary entry point into thinking about where interventions could be most effective. And in doing that, we came across this paper, which I'll admit we actually came across after writing most of our work. But it is from different contexts and interesting. Lawrence Lessig wrote this a bit more than 20 years ago, thinking about various kind of regulatory interventions outside of technology primarily. And he comes up with these 4 different approaches to have an intervention, only one of which is an actual law. But the architecture and markets and norms that go around that, having various interventions that are also equally possible. And in fact, there are opportunities for legal interventions to actually avoid bans and those kinds of solutions in lieu of affecting those other affordances. And so this work was trying to approach social media through 2 different maps. So the first one is as a product or as an architecture in terms of the paper, when specifically the affordances that are generated by that architecture. And the second is as a market, which of course there's a market for attention happening all the time, governed by incentives. And the idea of this is that, as you're going to see the maps in a second, they're obviously both describing the same underlying reality. So there's not that one is better than the other necessarily, but the things that each of these approaches make you think about that conjure are quite different, and therefore the problem that you are trying to address is easier to address. It's more efficient to address depending on what version of the world you view it under. And so even if there is a sort of isomorphism there, as a practical matter, there's not. So the first is as an architecture. Those of you who've seen my prior work, this is probably familiar, but just sort of a very simplified version of mapping the product components of social media, and this can be done in many other ways. Again, the key part is less the specific boxes, so because you could reorganize these in different ways, but that these boxes do exist as product components and that they interact with users in different ways. This is a very complicated table that sort of then takes those different boxes and tries to describe them, and I'll give a simplified version here. But basically, you can categorize the kinds of problems that those different boxes are likelier to be potentially exploited by, I guess is the way to say it, or that those kinds of problems that can be induced by poor implementation of those product features. And then once you do that, you can then map what those examples are to the various legislation that we talked about in that 12 different page appendix and categorize how many proposals actually are going after these products in this way. And what you see is that it is very unequal in terms of which parts of these systems are actually getting attention. And of course, the things that have gotten the most attention overwhelmingly are things like content itself, which I think there are places and roles for that, as this kind of argues. But just focusing on that is obviously very difficult and has free speech implications, whereas things like account creation or recommendation systems or other parts of this are very under-invested in as a proposed intervention. And the same thing applies for the market side of this. And if anything, even more so. So this is a very simplified version. There's a kind of more complicated story in the paper, but thinking about social media as a market for attention and the sort of various transactions that are occurring on there, you can do a similar component of this. So there are a number of market features that we really don't even have language for in the discussion of interventions here very often. So things like taxes and subsidies, which there are proposals like the ones in California for a tax on sort of revenue, which is one way to implement that. But you could imagine things like taxes or subsidies on the actual problematic parts of attention itself, which again is really hard to do, but as a framework, you can imagine that happening. And so you can do the same story here, right? So some parts of these things have gotten lots of attention. So things like compliance, particularly in the EU, lots and lots of attention on that. Some other things like ratings, property rights, less. I think the second part of this, so the paper itself doesn't go into a lot much more detail there. We did a companion that sort of takes that and does a bit of an argument about what part of this we think there's the highest value for more work to be done in directly. And there's a link here. So we can take this same thing, and the simplest version is obviously to just highlight the things where there's not enough work being done. We were a bit subjective in that characterization, of course. for the architecture part of this, I think the lowest lift thing that is probably the most opportunity space from these various analyses is on the account creation part of it. Many challenges come from things that we hold as normal and standard in other industries. So know your customer rules have lots of pedigree, lots of examples. They have very little in this world. And again, not a panacea, but the point is that for a certain class of problems, thinking about interventions here could be particularly effective, particularly for fraud, foreign adversary problems in this category. The second is content viewing. So this is distinct from the content itself. So infinite scroll versions, if viewed through this kind of a lens rather than a content lens, have a lot more opportunity. So that's sort of where the dark pattern work that Ravi and others have worked on kind of falls under. And then, of course, recommenders, which I don't think I need to tell this audience why it's important. But again, if analyzed through a lens of a more comprehensive look, has a very different valence to it than looking at the content itself. On the underemployed side for the markets, there are really interesting things. So again, more in the paper here about taxes and subsidies as it could be looked at here. But I think the usage overall is an opportunity for regulators to think about through this kind of a market. The design principles that we usually think about in terms of overall engagement are distinct from a way of considering what the motivations are as a product creator, right? And so realigning those incentives would be very central to this. Competition rules, we talk about the FTC and Lena Khan version of this frequently, and there's obviously opportunities for that. But we think of things like interoperability and data portability, if through this kind of a lens, would be much more compelling than if they were seen as sort of solo options around competition, right? They are sort of in service of a larger mission to make the market itself more likely to be aligned to the incentives of individuals. And then the last one here is direct provision, which there have been a few cases of this in other industries, but by that we mean governments spend lots and lots of money buying things, and that's a power that you could imagine being deployed strategically to try to create markets where they don't exist right now for other kinds of services that might have additional externalities to users. So my favorite example of this is sort of the NOAA weather data version. If you tried to think about what could government create of that type of profile that could induce better behavior, there's probably a lot of options for that. It would be much less controversial than trying to ban speech and could be particularly helpful for changing some of the norms that exist. That's it. I will give one more thing, which is the various threads here have touched on the misalignment between understanding of the problem and the reality of the problem. So it makes me think of when I was in the White House, I remember the communications director asking me multiple times whether something had broken through online, as if I had some sort of magic wand to answer that question. I think the keynote before sort of touched on equivalent there. And I think if we think about reframing that question as the wrong question in lieu of how do you make the systems themselves situate so that the things that break through are likelier, that's a question we have much more traction on, and we don't usually think about it that way. Thanks.
Thanks, Nate. This was a very good overview. I guess I'm just curious, is this US-centric, or is there, like, if I were to think globally, what would the picture look like?
So this work was US and EU overwhelmingly. There is a little bit of discussion of rest of the world, but we were focused there. So that is very much a blind spot in terms of opportunities. And I think given where the action is for the laws that would get companies to change their minds, that's probably still the appropriate way to think about it. There's a lot of distinctions here made in this around the various DSA provisions and sort of how they might or might not apply. Of course, the devil is in the details of what actually gets implemented there. So I think one hope here would be, if a state comes forward with a policy to implement some of that, they might think about some of these kinds of levers to make it more efficient.
Really interesting frameworks. I was struck that it didn't seem, at least it wasn't immediately clear, if there are certain outcomes that also you guys included in the map and what those were.
Yeah, so there's other work where that is delved into a lot more deeply. I think our thought here, particularly for the peer-reviewed part of it, was we're not giving the answers on what someone should care about. It's more, you come to the world with a problem that you care about. If you care about that problem, you should probably figure out an intervention that touches the most efficient way to actually address that. And that will have metrics associated with it, according to that part of it. So again, the account creation, just because I was talking about it, if you are concerned about the proliferation of misinformation on your platform, there are probably many, many different product components that could touch that, including banning content. But if you ignore the account creation part of it, among others, that problem gets much, much worse in a world where about 1% of the users account for about half of the activity. That's problematic.
If you look at the effect of GDPR on websites and platforms in the U.S., there's definitely an impact. Just going to the sort of international question, Robbie, is sort of building on that. Do you see sort of the carryover of U.S. law having a similar kind of impact internationally? And is it really true that we should think about these kinds of regulations as being national kinds of regulations? Maybe this is a question a bit for Andrea too. Or is it more once one country passes a law that's more of a universal kind of application?
I mean, I think as a practical matter, they're very often universal products, so as much as they can make it. The industry folks should jump in here if they disagree with that. I think there's no doubt that EU and US law is impacting global experiences. So again, it may not be the full suite of things that should happen, with should there rather than could, but again, as a floor of realigning those incentives, I think there's a real opportunity there to do that, and particularly in a world where in the US, especially, First Amendment concerns are very legitimate and very real. Pushing for other ways than that seems like a much more fruitful opportunity.
People can hear me okay? Sounds good? Okay. All right. So you're going to change gears a little bit. And sorry I wasn't able to be here yesterday or earlier today, but looking forward to talking with folks. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we evaluate how well companies are being managed and different policies that we have around trying to publicly disclose what's actually going on in organizations. And I apologize in advance for showing you this slide. But so here's the question, right? So do you think if you just copied what this guy does, you'd become the richest person in the world? No, right? No, right? I mean, most of us weren't born heir to an emerald mine fortune. Most of us don't have friends who could just cut us a check for $100 million when our company needs bailing out, right? But this is interesting because I think a lot of times we conflate financial performance with managerial competence, right? Well, we do, right? Like you could make me CEO of Amazon tomorrow, and I probably make a bunch of dumb decisions. I'm not going to affect their profitability this quarter, right? I mean, I could actually make them more profitable. I could can 90% of their R&D workers. They'll be more profitable, right? Now, again, to the extent that we don't think that's what's actually hard about managing organizations, the question, of course, is what actually matters for these more medium and long-term outcomes. And again, this is a very systemic problem within organizations, and I would argue just sort of management science in general. I mean, again, do you remember, I don't know if anyone from Netflix is here, but I'm going to rip on them. Do you remember the Netflix culture deck? Do people remember this? Right? Okay, so for those who don't remember it, Netflix, obviously a very successful company, but especially when they were growing really rapidly. Everyone was wondering, well, why are they growing so rapidly? And people were like, well, I know, it must be about their culture because their CEO has this weird slide deck that's got over 100 slides that talks about their culture, right? It turns out, if you've followed recently. Turns out their culture is crap. Right? It turns out that their product was so good that as long as they weren't doing things horribly incompetent from a management perspective, it wouldn't really matter until they faced some stiff competition. And now they are, and now they're not growing as quickly, right? But this is a fundamental problem, right? This idea of trying to discern what underlies success. And beyond that, even what we should optimize for, right? Like the idea of saying that I should optimize for profit this quarter, that's not an objective performance metric, right? That's something you decided that that's what you could, optimize for. And it's interesting thinking about this whole concept of what we should optimize, especially in business. But again, this even extends to obviously things like computer science or things where folks are talking about social media regulation. Like there's things that are quantitative, but very, very few things are objective. And it's interesting when you think where we are physically today, because, again, this is sort of the traditional homeland of the Massachusetts people. And for those who aren't familiar, they used to have this, and some tribes still do, this farming method called the Three Sisters. Are people familiar with this? Right? So for those who aren't, so basically the idea is that one way to grow crops, and in this case corn, beans, and squash, is you can sort of grow them all together. And what you're able to do is, sort of grow crops over a longer period of time. You don't have to leave fields fallow. And actually, if you look at it, this is a very efficient way to farm. And it's interesting comparing that to the way that a lot of the early European colonists farmed here, where they engaged in monoculture farming, right? So you'd plant a field full of, it could be corn, it could be wheat, whatever. And what they were trying to do is maximize the output per unit land of that particular crop, right? And that did way better than the Three Sisters method. However, if you're looking at caloric output, or even if you're looking at total economic value of the crops per unit land, the Three Sisters method is superior, right? But again, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for this narrow thing or a bigger thing? And again, it's not saying one is right or wrong, but that is a question, right? And thing we don't really interrogate when it comes to both businesses as well as, I would argue, computer systems, right? And it's interesting when we have this perspective, right? Because then you see companies like the large US tech companies at the end of 2022, despite being profitable, except for poor old Twitter, which doesn't exist anymore. But, look at the top three here, right? Meta, Amazon, Google, right? They're dramatically different sized companies, right? Amazon has millions of employees. Meta has, at this point, about 90,000, and Google had a couple 100,000. Point about 90,000, and Google had a couple 100,000. Okay? They fired almost exactly the same number of people. They're not even trying. Like, they're literally just copying each other. I mean, I actually have some inside information on this, right? But that's crazy, right? Like, there's decades of research. If you're a profitable company, one of the stupidest things you can do is massive layoffs. Right? Again, it doesn't mean you couldn't overhire, and we could talk more about this, but there's much more validated ways to reduce headcount than doing a massive layoff. And despite this, you get people who get, ridiculous, financial awards based on, again, current profitability. And actually, there's this question around, like, well, why is executive pay so high right now? Like, it's kind of weird. Like, what caused it? And it's actually funny if you go back. You don't have to go back that far, but it's mainly the fault of this guy, Felix Frankfurter, who was actually an advisor to FDR, and eventually became a Supreme Court justice after that. But during the Great Depression, there was a real problem, obviously, with, not just people not earning enough money. And so they had this question, though, of like, all right, well, how can we encourage companies to pay their employees more, right? And not like the minimum wage. It wasn't about that. It was about can we increase beyond that, right? How can we possibly encourage companies to pay people more, right? And they're like, well, I know. What we could do is we could require every company to publicly report out the compensation of their top executives. And what that's going to do is shame them because they're making so much, like they're going to take a lot less. Which is, of course, not what happened. What happened is all the CEOs of these companies were like, well, my buddy over at this other company is making twice what I'm making. Like, don't you think I'm worth it? And everyone's like, oh, yes, you are. And actually, if you look at the graph, it just is straight up from that point, right? Okay, so the idea that there is a market here, that this is inevitable, is just completely false, right? Like, these are choices that we've made. And, again, but I want to point out that the solution to this is not just to be able to. There's a necessary precondition to starting to make headway into more effectively managing organizations or compensating people, and it is around data. But I do want to point out that data by itself, in terms of the actual effects of managerial decisions or how people work, is not enough, right? And I'm going to show you the scariest graph in management for my money, which is this. Anyone a basketball fan here? There you go, a couple. So, Boston, we're now the basketball capital of the world, at least for the next, year, hopefully longer. And so it's really fascinating. So pro basketball in the US, before 1979, there was no three-point line, right? So every shot was only worth 2 points, okay? So I want to show you something. See this equation? If you can fill out the sort of variables for this equation, you will get 100% of the variance of offensive performance. 100%, okay? So subject to certain accuracy, or shooting accuracy, it is better to take more three-point shots per game. It's indisputable. Like literally, you cannot argue with it. It is impossible. Okay. So knowing this, right, you say, well, people are rational, right? So you'd expect that, okay, well, maybe you say, well, listen, pro basketball players, they hadn't practiced these longer shots before. So maybe it would take them, 4 years or something to get up to an optimal level. Or maybe you could say, no, it's a generational thing. People have to, for like their whole career, when they're kids, start to practice these longer shots. And so maybe you'd expect it to take 20 years and then get to an optimal level, which is not what happened, right? It took 40 years. Actually, in 2019, we did finally get to an optimal level. Okay? But so why is this scary? Well, this is scary because most industries, we don't have a math equation that captures literally 100% of the variance of performance. And basketball, the other thing about it is there's 82 games a year with an actual objective outcome. And again, I rarely use the word objective, right? It's like how many points did you score? It's did you win or lose, right? And you're being beaten over the head 82 times a year with the fact that it's better to do this. And yet it still took 40 years to get to this point. Right? Now you think about business, right? If you're CEO of a Fortune 500 company, like how many reorgs will they oversee over the course of their career? I don't know, 5 if they have a long career? And the conditions are different every time, right? So maybe it's not surprising that people just copy each other. But to be clear, that's what everyone's doing. Like people are just copying each other. No one knows what they're doing. And I've always wondered about this, like what would happen if you just put some person, you just made them the CEO of some large company, right? And this basically is, for my money, in terms of where we have data on results, there's only one instance in recent history where that's happened, and that's actually Burger King. Okay? So in 2011, Burger King was bought by 3G Capital, private equity firm. They've since been taken public again. But then in 2014, the guy who'd been the CEO of the company left. And 3G made one of their 32-year-old associates, they made him CEO of Burger King. All right? He'd only managed a team of 5 before then, and they paid him $700,000 a year, which is still a lot of money, right? But okay, like just for context, Jack in the Box in 2014 was the same size business as Burger King. And if you look at any basically formal metric you look at, they're essentially equivalent. All right? And the CEO of Jack in the Box was getting paid $13 million a year. All right? Any time horizon you look at for these two companies after 2014, Burger King just wipes the floor with Jack in the Box, wiped the floor with them. Right? And now the CEO of Burger King gets paid more, which whatever, good for him. I literally don't care. But if you're the board of Jack in the Box, you better be damn sure that this CEO is at least 20 times better than some guy. And clearly they're not. Clearly, right? And so this is the thing, though, is that, okay, so let's ask a question, like, how are companies even valued? Like, does anyone know, how do we value a company? How do we determine what is the market value of company X? Does anyone know, like, what the value is supposed to be? What was that? Multiple of earnings? Well, typically it's a little bit, typically it's a share of future profits. Future profits, okay? So here's a question. Does anyone know what the predictive power of current profits are on future profits? Like profits this quarter. Or again, you can go back for the last year, I don't care. Do you know what the predictive power is? It's 1% of the variance. 1%. So it's basically nothing. So we're basically all fooling ourselves, right? That this really matters, right? And which is always funny because then, again, a lot of, my work has been around trying to use metrics about how work happens, how people actually work, to then look at these things, right? And actually to look at these longer term effects. And so now, and again, I literally don't care if we call it ESG or not, but this idea that now a number of private equity firms and as well as larger firms like State Street have started to use very simple metrics about how companies are managed. I mean, it's fascinating to me that until like pretty recently, this is still true of a lot of companies, like you don't know how many employees, like you invest $1 billion in a company and you don't know how many employees they have. Like, it's just crazy, right? right? Or again, this idea that these are reasonable questions, right? Like, okay, what percent of your employees leave every year? Like, yes, you should know that. If it's like 100% and I'm investing in a bank, like I am going to sell that stock, and you don't know that today. But again, the point is that we can do much better, right? The point is that today we have so much data about how work happens, right? We've got email, chat, meeting data. We even have sensor data about the real world. And there's a much longer discussion that we can go into about how you derive meaning out of that kind of data. But what I would argue for right now is important for understanding and for driving policy decisions around, corporate governance and management more broadly. The idea isn't to focus on what's good. Good is very contextual. Good is very hard to do, right? Like if I'm looking at behavioral data saying, how much time should managers interact with employees and their team? How much time should the board spend with different parts of the company? How siloed is the organization? Meaning that behaviorally we can talk about it. It's highly contextual. Like without KPIs and without good performance metrics, you can't really say anything. However, dumpster fires are much more universal, right? This idea that, like, all right, I barely care what kind of work an industry is doing, but if over the course of, let's say for company X, if over the course of a whole quarter, the executive team spends less than 2% of their time with frontline employees, like, I don't care what you're doing, like that's a huge problem. Right? And now again, there could be contextual reason why it's going on. It could be factory caught on fire, whatever. But just like if you miss on profitability this quarter and you have to explain, well, listen, I know that we missed on our profitability number, but listen, we had a strategic opportunity to acquire company X, and so we did it. Fine. But in a similar way, again, if you're become horribly siloed, and again, meaning that, quantitatively, if it's taking you well over a year to hire an employee on average, if you're hemorrhaging employees, if you're incredibly, demographically homogeneous, like those are real huge financial risks of the firm. And again, it's much easier to focus on those sort of outliers that are demonstrably terrible, right? Like that's really easy. And again, I can tell you now from working with lots of very large companies, everyone's a different shade of terrible at this point. No one's good, right? So we got a lot of runway with this approach. Because we could talk more about what I've been doing. Again, I know I'm almost out of time. So one thing that I'll say is that actually over at MIT, created a salient people metrics working group. So I got people from a bunch of different, just people related to social science and measurement. Some folks at HBS have also been participating. We've also got leadership from a couple of big asset managers in the US. I guess it's recorded. It's recorded, right? Okay, I won't say certain things. It's fine, but it's nice to have them on. It's okay. Well, I want there to be a recording. Okay, but it's interesting. It's great to have people from finance in on this because then they are like. So there's going to be some pieces coming out in the coming months where we talk about what metrics we think companies should have to publicly report out and that should be used to determine executive comp. And the point is not that any particular metric is right or wrong, right? People can argue about the exact things. But again, the idea that if you look at on the hiring side, if you look at the employee base, if you look at management, how people work, there's a number of pretty straightforward things. There's like a couple dozen metrics or like concepts that, again, when things are awful, like need to be known and are huge financial risks. And so I'd love to leave time for questions and also hopefully get us a little bit more back on time. Got a book coming out on some of this stuff next year. That's it. Thanks, everyone. Any questions? Yeah, sure. Okay.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
It's refreshing. But it seems like basically the assumption is that people metrics are going to predict future earnings better than current earnings.
Yes. Yes. And they do. Like there's, yeah. So I think this is sort of the thing, right? Is that, and there's some work that I've done both through a company I started, which I left earlier this year, as well as just some other work I've now done individually. But also there's, I mean, this is the point. There's obviously decades of work now in social science of people like being able to show that, we can look at metrics about how work happens. And again, a lot of them in the past have been survey-based, and I like survey data. I don't think you can use that for a lot of these purposes because the perverse incentives it creates for managers. Like if I pay you based on, let's say, engagement survey results. Well, if I'm the CEO, I could fire everyone who answers lower than a 4, right? You could do that, right? Or I could be even more clever, right? I could push out the engagement surveys only when it's a sunny day and only let you answer those surveys on a sunny day, and my scores will be 30% higher. Again, I'm not saying it's like a useless survey, but you start to create weird things for those. So I do think looking more at again, I say like behavioral data. So again, on the hiring side, this is sort of things around the pipeline, and there's other folks who are more expert in this than I am, but you're talking about, and really focusing a lot on aspects of the organization that are just really terrible, right? Again, good is very contextual, but terrible is pretty easy. But yes, like the argument is that this is much better than just profit by itself, and a lot of the larger firms I've been working with recently, I mean, first of all, people pretty much have no argument against this. It's more a question of how do you start to build this into how they manage businesses, talking to some regulators around, ideally different regulators require folks to put this out. I don't think that's coming, as much as I like the folks at the SEC, I don't think they listen to me. The EU folks didn't listen to me. It's fine. They don't, not that they should necessarily listen to me, but it's been more interesting looking at folks in like private equity to do this, and they'll make more money doing this, and then other people will do it. That's sort of the current thinking. Yeah. Right. Other questions? No? No? Ravi, yeah.
So I can see how this works for private equity because I'm not a private equity person.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
Yeah.
As I understand private equity working,
Yep.
if you invest in a large number of companies and it kind of averages out.
Yeah.
But I guess it feels like for an individual company,
Yep.
some of these things still, might or might not be true. And I guess I'd just be curious what your thoughts are. Like, is this the kind of thing that has to be averaged out across can this be true across a lot of companies, but maybe my company, these kinds of, every company is a unicorn to some degree.
Sure, yeah. Well, this is the thing. Everyone wants to think they're special, and they're not, right? No, I mean, it's true, though, right? So a lot of the ways, at least for the group that we put together, that we've crafted it, is such that, like, if you're reaching certain levels of something, like, you really got to explain it. Like, that's it. Now, again, ideally, you get to eventually industry-level stuff. We're just not there yet, right? So you have to be super conservative and do, like, way less than before. I think with private equity, to your point, and one of the reasons I've been very happy to start working with them in the last year and a half is that they are structurally very nicely positioned to do this. Because, first of all, at least for the guys that I work with they're really large and they, buy very large companies. But their business model is you buy a company and then in 5 to 7 years you take it public or you sell it. But what that means is profitability this quarter, is not super important. You don't really care. The question, of course, is how can I invest to make this company worth a lot more money which again, really lends itself well to these things. I think private equity is also nicely situated because if I'm private equity, I get 100% of the value I create from this. Whereas in public companies right now, I think a lot of the incentives, and we actually have a piece coming out in Harvard Law Review for some folks out of Harvard Law about this soon. There's a lot of issues around board director incentives and other things that make this much harder to do in the near term. But the idea is that most private equity companies, at least the guys I'm working with, they maintain board seats afterwards, right? And they will keep asking for these kind of metrics. And so the thinking is eventually this will be required on the public markets. Importantly, if you look at the history of corporate disclosures, what's actually fascinating is that if you read a 10K, for people familiar with financial disclosure reporting, they're hilarious. So go back and read a 6-year-old 10K because they're we manage company good. And you're how is this crazy? They don't even report profit, right? Again, I'm not saying profit doesn't matter, right? But it is actually crazy that people gave these companies money. So the idea that profit and loss and these other things are inevitable is unclear. I mean, actually, fun fact is that through most of the 1950s, pretty much every public company reported out the gender breakdown of their shareholders. And actually, U.S. Steel randomly kept doing it to 1982, which is a fun fact. Now you're well, why don't they keep doing that today? Well, it's because it turned out that starting to the end of the 1950s, a bunch of the largest companies in the country, they had a majority women shareholders. And so then a bunch of women's rights groups started to say, we're the majority of shareholders. Shouldn't there be some women on boards? And it's probably a coincidence that that's when they stopped reporting out the gender of their, it's probably a coincidence. Anyway, but again, the idea that is something we could still have today. It was a choice to not do it. And so, but importantly, a lot of the things around, again, profit, around revenue, they eventually were regulated to have more standards. But that's not how they started. Right? They started at first because investors said, we need this to make a, informed investment. And so again, I would argue that this stuff is exactly the same. And I think that a lot of these firms are going to make a lot more money doing this, which I also, even as recorded, I barely care about that. Like, I don't really care about that. That's nice, but what it does mean is that hopefully what this will do is stop companies from doing like horrible things like burning out the workforce, whole variety of other things, which are provably financially horrible for companies. So if you improve that, and there's a lot of evidence that this sort of approach can move those needles way faster than saying doing this is going to increase your performance by 10%. Most of my time is still spent with CEOs of large companies, right? And the incentives are not really set up for them to want to do this, right? And that's sort of what I talked about earlier.
How you think about, we talked a little bit with Nathaniel about how U.S. regulation influences international regulation and how, like GDPR, for example, influenced the U.S. How do you think about your own legislation as being a tool for having global impact versus having local impact?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, we follow regulation because of the freedom of speech aspect from the get-go when the Digital Services Act, for example, was talked about, and then throughout the process, also now it's slowly being implemented. So we had the Commissioner Vera Jourova visiting our agency about 2 years ago. And so we had extensive talks with her about the risks and vulnerabilities and consequences of regulation. And in those days, I was talking to somebody about this today, Ravi, I think. I was thinking to myself, and my analysis, of course, then reflected that, but I was saying, okay, well, if you implement these sort of regulatory rules, and I realized that, I guess, regulation from Brussels and the DSA is a democratic way of applying pressure on the companies. And so if you start implementing this, okay, well, they might maybe over-regulate themselves because they still self-regulate. That's the sort of one caveat in this whole thing. And so maybe sort of like take down content and verify later kind of thing, just so that they don't get fined. That was one thing I thought, okay, we have to monitor this. And in those days, the companies were extensively talking about debunking, pre-bunking. Microsoft was talking about pre-threat. So I was thinking, okay, this might be going hand in hand. And also, I was thinking to myself, from a cultural perspective, the companies are American, and now they might sort of, since they will perhaps kind of accelerate this, they might be going into content way too much, and also using their cultural references being American companies and not really being able to tap into something that would then by extension affect Sweden, for example, and understand more of cultural context, language context, and all that. But what we see today is that the companies are actually, they've pulled back a bit. They have less emphasis on trust and safety. They are changing the way their feeds look like. For example, Meta now, they are removing media content more and more, news in the feed. So there's less links to media. And so my take is that they're probably trying to sort of amend a bit in how they are going to have to address content moderation. They're doing this in the background. So the feeds will look different. Well, that means maybe that there will be less political sort of talk, so to speak, or opinion building will be shifting to go somewhere else. So it's a continuum, so we follow it from a variety of perspectives. GDPR, I mean, it's intended to protect users, as is DCA. The DCA is also, the intention is to protect users, ultimately. So, but they have a different focus, which means that data is one thing, but when it comes to regulation and the possibility of it infringing on freedom of speech because it focuses on content, it's a real fine balance, and this is something that we continue to monitor. I hope I answered your question.
I think it's a question for Ben, and maybe it's a bit of a naive question. What is your hypothesis for why, I mean, it's very compelling what you're saying.
Yeah.
Why this has caught on? It seems like, like people, like big funds investing in companies that pay like millions and billions of
Yeah.
US dollar based on valuation, that seems to be explaining 1%.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, yeah.
So, okay, there's, not that I know the answer necessarily, but my strong, and especially now working more with some folks, in the area. So at this point, it's very interesting. So in the U.S., if you have a combination of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, they own at least pretty much 20% of every publicly listed company in the U.S. And in the S&P 500, they own over 50% of, I believe, every firm. And that's important for a few reasons, right? This is sort of that concentration has increased over time. But by and large, even historically, when it was less concentrated, you had large firms like CalPERS, which is a large pension firm that would appoint board members for these companies, right? So now let's say you're a BlackRock employee, and I appoint you to a board, okay? And it is your fiduciary duty to oversee like the management of that company, how we compensate people, those things. So like you were saying, theoretically, what I should try to do is figure out like, are you actually creating value as a CEO, all these things, right? However, for those, I don't know if people are familiar with the corporate board literature, there's some fascinating things on board interlocks. Like the question, of course, is like, let's say I get put on company A's board, and you're also on that board. But you're also on another board, because people tend to be on lots of boards. My likelihood of being appointed to that other board you're on is really high, really high. So now beyond that, think about the fact that most public company CEOs are also on their board. Right? So literally the person you're supposed to be overseeing is on their board. Like they are overseeing themselves, which is crazy. Like that doesn't make sense. But so now imagine that I'm on this board and I'm some employee at one of these companies and they cycle me around to these other firms. Me exercising stronger oversight over you or saying I'm going to pay you less means you're not going to like me. You're going to be much less likely to recommend that I get appointed to this other board that you're also on. Right? And beyond that, let's say I, as an individual board director, start doing something weird. I start asking for these metrics. No one's asked for them yet, right? But let's say I start doing something weird. I start asking for these metrics. And Robbie sort of brought this up before, right? That an individual company, so here's the thing. So let's say I run a car company, and I'm the best managed company in the world. But then let's say tomorrow the market for cars tanks. It doesn't matter that I'm the best run company in the world. Like, we're still going to go out of business. Right? And so now imagine that I'm a board member there. And listen, if you're the CEO of a company or you're the board member of one of these companies and performance goes really bad, like you could get fired. But I guarantee you, if performance is bad and you're doing something no one else is doing, you will get fired, 100%. So, and again, right now, you can pretty much turn the crank, right? So if I put you on a board of State Street, which is right over there, right? Like, they're going to be profitable, right? You don't have to do very much. Like, as long as you don't do horribly illegal things, like, you're going to be fine. So it's in your personal self-interest to turn the crank on these things. Now, again, this Harvard Law Review piece I've got out, coming out later, we actually lay out the argument for those board directors to get sued if they're not looking at these things. So we'll see. So we'll see if that works. But yeah, I think there's a number of incentives set up. So, and the last thing I'll say is the sort of data I'm referring to, you couldn't have asked for that 20 years ago, right? Like you couldn't do it, right? Now we do have these systems in place, right? Like what is it? People analytics, like as a job title, is the second fastest growing job title in the US right now, which is pretty cool. So there now are all these systems around what's going on within companies. But, again, 20 years ago, if I, asked most companies, what's the average tenure of employees in your organization, you like literally couldn't answer that, right? So you couldn't get much better. It was hard enough getting them financial metrics.